for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network.
All right. Good evening, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Today is Thursday, March 2nd, 2023. And tonight, the Beard of Knowledge, Randall Carlson, is with us. And I'm going to steal something. I'm going to see if tonight I can handle the Randall. I've been drinking coffee all day. I've got to be on my A game. Randall Carlson is with us. And tonight's an exclusive evening, and we are going to be discussing our secret history. And just that kind of statement, that's bold, it's wide, it's cinematic, it's a huge subject. And there's a lot to discuss tonight with Randall. Very excited about this. He's a master builder. He's an architectural designer. He's a teacher. And this is the thing with Randall. And I say this every time he's on the show and every time that I talk about him. I just want to learn. That's all I want to do. And Randall will teach you something. I've had lots of long conversations. I'm going to throw Randall under the bus. I taught Randall something about 6 months ago. We were on the phone and we were talking rocks. And I said, hey, when I bring him on, we're going to talk about this. I said, have you ever heard? And he said, no, tell me about it. We ended up staying on the phone for about 3 hours. And I'm going to do this right now. I'm going to say, Randall, welcome to the show. And do you remember that 3-hour conversation about giant rock in California?
Oh, yes. I got to confess, I haven't made it out there yet, but when I do, I'll be calling you because I'm expecting you to act as my host and guide.
You know what an honor that's going to be? Can you, when we've got so much to discuss tonight, Randall, I want to jump straight into it, but you know rocks. And when you saw that picture of giant rock, 10 stories tall, it's the biggest, freestanding rock in the world, but it's pink granite. What for you, what went through your mind to see a chunk of pink granite that big?
Well, of course, the first question was how the hell it got there. Right. And I think I've got a pretty good handle. I mean, I'm looking for the more prosaic explanation first before I go to exotic explanations. That's the one rule of science, right? Go for the simplest thing, the most straightforward. And if that doesn't work, then you go progressively to more esoteric sounding explanations for things. But there was there's a mountain there composed of very similar pink granite. So somehow you had to dislodge that huge rock from that mountainside and transport it to the floor of the valley. So in my mind, what I was seeing there was evidence of some type of a catastrophic event. Because normal things are not going to transport rocks. Everyday processes and forces typically do not transport rocks of that magnitude. So I'm thinking some kind of a seismic event, some kind of something, we know that there have been many catastrophes in the history of this planet we live on. And given that we know that, even though the geological establishment, I think, is still a little behind the curve on it, they are more and more aware that in order to understand the history of this planet, we have to understand that there are periodic catastrophes that can shake things up. Knowing that, that's kind of where I would gravitate to, Jimmy.
The amount, after I talked to you about it, and I was standing at Giant Rock and checking it out, and thinking of the amount of water, right, that that would have to displace a rock of that size. Now there's rocks and boulders all around it that are also big, 2-3 stories tall. They're huge. You can wrap your mind around that, I guess, a little bit. But thinking about the amount of water that must have pushed that, over, it came from somewhere else, right? And then went down the hill and landed there. What kind of water are we talking about? 300, 400, 500 feet of 200 mile an hour gushing water. What would move something like that?
Well, in this case, my thought is the primary force was gravity. But now there is evidence, excuse me, from all over Southern California, particularly the Mojave Desert region, of really large-scale floods having happened perhaps multiple times, but certainly within relatively recent geological times. There are features all over the desert, including the desert floor itself is mostly alluvium, water placed. I don't know if we want to get into some of that. I could show some slides that show exactly what I'm talking about. My guess, Jimmy, would be that, like so many of these catastrophes, when they happen, you have multiple things, sub-catastrophes happening in tandem. So in this case, we could be looking two things: flooding and seismic shaking. In other words, earthquakes that could dislodge rocks. They're now tumbled to the valley floor, and you now have floods that could move those rocks potentially. If you've got now the transport capacity of flowing water depends on the velocity primarily. That's the primary thing. The second thing I think we could say would be viscosity, so that you could have pure clean water could transport in one way, and then if you have highly viscous water, like loaded with sediment and mud and things like that, you can actually entrain larger rocks in the more viscous fluid flows. So, and of course, if you've got, when we're talking about catastrophic flooding, typically a normal stream, unless it's got highly erosive channel, it will clear out the channel of all excess sediment, and then eventually the water will flow clean. I mean, if you've ever seen in the aftermath of a heavy rainstorm, you go out to a creek, the water will be flowing much more copiously than normal, and it'll be muddy, choked with sediment. You come out there 3, 4, 5 days later, and you look, and after the normal creek flow has been reestablished, you'll see that the water is now flowing relatively clear. And what happens in mega floods is you have mega sedimentary transportation. So a mega flood, and again, the competency of flowing water to entrain and transport sediment of all kinds, of different sizes and so forth, is primarily a function of the velocity. So if the water is moving really fast, and typically what we've seen in some of the great scabland floods up in the Pacific Northwest is that the peak velocity, I think at this point that the models have come up with, is around 80 miles per hour. Now that doesn't mean it couldn't be happening faster than that, because again, velocity of the water is going to be a function of the gradient. So a shallow gradient, water's moving slower. As you steepen that gradient, the water flows faster. So you got to look at all of these things, Jimmy. It's not as simple as you might think.
Yeah, it never is, right? It never is. And some of your actually, can I get to the breaking news? I want your opinion on this.
Yeah.
And then we'll swing it back. We're going to be talking rocks all night long, so we'll come back to that. But today, next to the Great Pyramid, there was a press conference. And they announced, and this is like big news because this never happens. They announced a second corridor has been found inside of the Great Pyramid. I am going to pull this image up. This is now I'm guessing here, if we think about the construction of the Great Pyramid, that the cantilever, the ceiling here, the angled ceiling, is probably pink granite, like they did in the King's Chamber, right? The relieving chambers above that. The rest of this is probably limestone. But anyway, this is 30 feet long, 7 feet wide. And if it's 7 feet wide, that's somewhere between 7 and 10 feet tall in the middle of the, what would you call that? Gable? What do you call that angle?
Yes, you could call it a gable.
And this wasn't supposed to exist. Now, this is the second chamber inside of the Great Pyramid that has been discovered in the last 4 years. This sits right behind that gabled entrance that has been exposed on the outside of the Great Pyramid. It's not the main entrance to it, but the Persians, blasted that away many hundreds of years ago and exposed that section. That's where this sits, and then points in. What do you make of this? And do you think that there's other stuff inside of the Great Pyramid that's yet to be discovered?
Well, sure. I mean, this to me certainly increases the likelihood of that possibility. That there are still. I mean, my instincts tell me there's a lot to be discovered yet, and so it's not shocking or surprising to me. What I'm looking at here now and wondering is, was this accessible from the outside?
Yeah. Now, so when you look at the quick answer, what's that?
This is the endoscopic camera that's put in there, so nobody actually accessed.
No, not yet. Yeah, not yet. And so when you see that gabled part on the outside of the pyramid, what they have shown is, with like a red arrow, where this is approximately with that in the height of the Great Pyramid. So it's about a third of the way up the side, where that entrance is. And then this sits behind that.
Could they ever have been connected?
That's a great question. And this is the other comment that they made today, Randall, that they think that this is a corridor leading to another chamber. Yeah. And they suspect that, down at the end of that hallway right there is the entrance to something. And for them to say that, I think they know more than what they're telling us right now.
Well, now you've got my curiosity aroused. So there could be a door at that other end and something behind it.
Yeah, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Something being what exactly?
And the other chamber that they found, and I'm sure you remember, it was back in 2017, 2018, above the Grand Gallery. And that one's 90 feet long, right? 15 feet tall, 15 feet wide. And it's the same angle as the Grand Gallery. It's ginormous, and it sits above it. And nobody knows anything about that yet. They haven't gotten into it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will be waiting with bated breath for more disclosure, and I hope it's forthcoming.
Can I ask you, now I'm going to ask you a strange question. I've never talked to you about this. Atlantis, that A word is something that you've discussed in the past in ancient civilizations, and we'll get there eventually tonight. But what about aliens? Do you ever consider an ET off-planet influence on us in the distant past?
I'm certainly not going to categorically reject the possibility in the distant past. I have certain questions about whether or not it is currently happening on the level that some people believe it is. I've looked into a lot of the doctrines that seem to suggest that there was some kind of an extraterrestrial contact. And certainly, when we look at mythology, we can see a number of layers to it that I think. And one, looking at it, say, from the geological end, you didn't mention in the bio leading up to that, but one of the things I study is geomythology, which is actually now a legitimate scientific discipline, looking at the stories of old and the myths and the legends and the tales and so forth to try to tease out valid scientific, geological, and or astronomical or other kinds of scientific information, right? So having immersed myself into the geological and the catastrophist component of it, I now, I take not only symbolically, but literally both. You have to look at them both ways. When you start looking at these stories of great catastrophes, whether it's gigantic floods, which is probably the most prevalent universal tradition that ancient cultures held in common, this idea that their ancestors had survived some tremendous watery cataclysm that wiped out most of the human race. Now, the standard explanation for that is that these are exaggerated memories of regional events, which doesn't really place it outside of things that we may have experienced in our own modern times in terms of very large floods. If we go, and let's set up a yardstick here. If we go back 20th century in America, two of the largest volume floods measured were both on the Mississippi River, and they peaked out at just over 1 million cubic feet per second. Largest documented floods in the Mississippi. Last one was 1993. At the time, it was the most expensive natural disaster in American history. That summer of 93 when the Mississippi flooded its banks. And I think it got up to just peak for a day or a couple of days, maybe about 1.2 million cubic feet per second. So we now know that in the history of this planet, and actually very recently in the history of this planet, there have been floods approaching 1 billion cubic feet per second. So if you think 1 million cubic feet per second, 1 billion cubic feet per second, we're talking literally peak discharges of floods that were 1,000 times greater than the Mississippi flood of 1993. Now, try to imagine, that was economically, and it was devastating to the infrastructure along there, the tributaries of the Mississippi, of course, the rivers and creeks flowing in. When you have that great a volume coming down the main trunk valley, it's going to backflood into the tributaries, and it's going to be erosive. It's going to be depositional. It'll sweep things away. It'll deposit, thick layers of mud and bury stuff. Now, if we're talking about 1 billion cubic feet per second, try to imagine what would be the cultural implications or the implications to any infrastructure in the mid-United States if you had that flow coming down the Mississippi, but it was 1,000 times greater than the greatest measured historical cataclysmic flood. You see, now you can start getting your head wrapped around, the scale of these kinds of events. So what I'm getting at here, and here's the point I'm actually getting to, is that I think we can safely say now that behind the floods of myth, these gigantic world-destroying floods, there are real floods of an unimaginably cataclysmic scale that are now well documented to have occurred in the history of this planet. Okay, so what I'm saying there, okay, we take one dimension of our ancient myths, the cultural stories that have come down to us, and we can go, clearly we can demonstrate that behind this, there is a literal, actually scientifically verifiable phenomena that happened. Now, given that, what are some of the other elements of the ancient stories? Well, this brings us back to your question, because just as ubiquitous as the idea of these cataclysmic floods occurring, there was the interaction of humans with the gods.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now let's imagine that, okay, behind these tales and stories and myths and scriptures and things, there's this real events that have inspired those. And the other example that I use is oftentimes wars of the gods. I mean, like, look at the myth of Phaeton. Plato tells us right at the beginning of Timaeus that the myth of Phaeton, even though it has the appearance of myth, it's not mythical. It's something that actually happened. Something descended from the sky and set the world on fire. And even ancient, I think Origen is one. There's others that have looked at that and definitely concluded that the myth of Phaeton literally refers to the close encounter between Earth and a disintegrating comet. And that makes perfect sense. And the description, the details, and so forth that are just in that myth alone, along with a lot of the other myths that are similar, really do seem to point to the fact that there was cosmic phenomena, encounters with asteroids and or comets, that kind of thing. And we know from the Younger Dryas now, at 12,850 to 12,900 years ago, from those studies, we find not only the soot and proxies of great impacts, the nanodiamonds, the microspherules, and the layers of soot, which seems to indicate burning biomass. And in most cases, that seems to immediately precede the flood deposits that are also associated with the Younger Dryas. So it clearly seems to suggest the encounter between Earth and some kind of a bolide being a generic term for an entity from space, striking the Earth or coming so close to it that it could cause effects. So we've got two examples there now where we can turn to ancient myths. And behind the outer form of those myths, it appears that there is literal, scientific, verifiable, natural phenomena that has occurred. The third that we find ubiquitous, embedded in the myths, like I just referenced, is this idea of the gods. And clearly, in some cases, I think the gods are referring to, if you have a piece of a comet nucleus spalling off, coming into Earth's atmosphere, it is going to be one hell of an impressive light show. It's going to really impress and blow the minds of anybody that could witness it that is not wiped out in the process, right? One could conflate that with saying, well, here's the manifestation of the god. And I think that is one of the ways that these myths and stories have come down to us, is that these natural phenomena, which are cosmic in origin, are of such a scale that we see this with the 1908 event in Siberia, the famous Tunguska event. That was interpreted by the Tungusis who witnessed such a thing as being the descent of Agni, the fire god. And so right there we see the conflation between myth and reality, right? So now let's get to that back to your question. I've made a kind of a long, convoluted route here, but back to your question. What is then, if any, the real phenomena behind the interaction with gods that clearly seem anthropogenic in some respect and not so readily interpretable as being a rock from space, but something intelligent that people are interacting? I mean, how do you say, well, the stories of Isis and Osiris coming in, being teachers, teaching agriculture and architecture and mathematics, and this is the kind of thing that we see over and over again in the stories. Typically, you would not attribute the teaching of agriculture or architecture to a rock from space, right?
Well, you have to ask yourself, where does that come from? And let me ask you this: when you go back to the billions of gallons of displacement per minute, or whatever that crazy number is, when you have something like the Younger Dryas happen, when and I'm guessing here, I'm not an expert, but there are miles of glacier ice covering North America and, much of the world, but North America, miles thick over Manhattan, for instance, and you have a cosmic event happen. Is the climate change that occurs from that enough to cause melting and that kind of displacement of water over North America?
Absolutely, Jimmy. I think you're actually beginning to get a grasp of this thing after years and years and years of me trying to explain it to you. I think
starting to get here.
Yeah, well, yes, and I think the answer is yes, because now over Manhattan, the ice, just for scientific clarification, wouldn't have been miles thick. In fact, I after a lot of study, I'm of the mind now that the maximum thickness of the ice sheet over its central dome, which was central Canada, was about 1.5 miles. I don't think it quite got to 2 miles thick. It maybe, it's hard to say. It is hard to say. How do we measure that? Well, we're measuring it by the rate at which land is rebounding, because with that tremendous weight of ice, what's happened is it's, basically caused the land to subside by probably up to a couple of thousand feet. And it's just like this comfortable chair I'm sitting right on right now. There's a basin that is subsiding because I'm sitting on it. And then when I get up, it'll rebound. Now, there's a geological term for that vertical movement of the Earth's crust that occurs when surface loading is moved, when it's changed, right? It's called isostatic compensation. So, crust of the Earth can be depressed if you place a weight on it. It can rebound if you take the weight away.
No, let me jump in, Randall. Hold on. When that happens on this side of the planet in North America, something's got to give on the other side of the.
Wow, I'm really impressed, Jimmy. You must be. You've been thinking about some of this. You're exactly right. And here's the way to think about it. Imagine you've got a beach ball, and at the North and the South Pole, you've got this huge accumulation of ice. And so it compresses. Now, obviously with a beach ball, when it's inflated, it's going to be circular. It's going to be spherical. The Earth is not exactly, as you know, the Earth is not exactly spherical. It's because of the spin, the centrifugal force, it bulges at the equator. So the equator distance diameter of that spheroid actually, is 26 miles greater than the polar diameter, right? Now, like you said, if you take that beach ball, if you press it this way, it bulges this way, doesn't it? That's exactly, and that right there, Jimmy, is an example of isostatic compensation. And so, yes, if you are depressing, and see, I go into an elaborate explanation on this relative, and it bears directly on the question of Atlantis, which is where it gets really interesting, because Atlantis is essentially, if we take Plato at his word, Atlantis was a large complex of islands that sank and beneath the ocean. I mean, he literally says that it sank. It was an earthquake, and consequence of that earthquake, the island and or islands of Atlantis sank, right? Well, the date that he gives is very interesting because it's 9,000 years before Solon's exile in Egypt, which occurred roughly 600 BC. So if you do the math, 600 BC is 2,600 years ago, and add 9,000 years to that, and that's 11,600 years ago. Well, 11,600 years ago is now precisely the transition point between the previous Pleistocene era that lasted, or epoch that lasted for 2.5 million years, and the present Holocene. And there's an event, two things. There was a climatic event, which is the end of the Younger Dryas. It's in geological terms, the Younger Dryas ended at the stage of the Younger Dryas, replaced by the stage of the pre-boreal. That's dated 11,600 years ago. And it's associated with a large warming spike in the climate of the Northern Hemisphere. And in fact, that signal is more and more evidence is suggesting that warming signal is global in extent. Associated with that warming was what the marine geologists, the oceanographers, called meltwater pulse 1b. So meltwater pulse 1b was this gigantic pulse of meltwater rapidly introduced into the world's oceans at 11,600 years ago, exactly when Plato dates the sinking of Atlantis. Now, conventional academia is just not even going to pay attention to that. If you question about them, it's nothing more than a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's a confirmation of modern scientific evidence confirming what ancients knew and passed down to us, our ancient ancestors.
Now, wasn't 1B also associated with the landmass that disappeared between the UK and Europe, and Doggerland?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Doggerland disappeared in several stages because you had that whole area between what is now the British Isles and the European mainland, which during the late glacial maximum, you got to keep in mind that as you're locking this ice up on top of the land, it's being extracted from the oceans. Now, normally what happens is, winter, like think about the snowfall we're getting in the West and in Canada and stuff this year, huge amounts of snow, a lot of snowpack. What's going to happen when the weather warms? That's all going to melt. So in the annual cycle of the year, right, from winter to summer. You've got accumulation. You've got sort of, I guess what you could say, like an interruption of the annual hydrological cycle. So, in other words, it precipitates over the northern hemisphere, but it's frozen in the form of snow. Come spring, it melts and flows back. Now, in the summer, the rainfall is going to fall on the land. Some of it's going to evaporate. Some of it's going to be taken up by plants in the biosphere. Others is going to go into the groundwater. But the hydrological cycle is continuous, right? Then it's interrupted for 6-7 months a year in the northern hemisphere. Now, at that point, the precipitation occurs over the land. It builds up, and you might have 20 or 30 feet of snowpack by the end of the season, right? Well, now let's extrapolate to an ice age. What happens with an ice age is the normal hydrological cycle is interrupted, and the evidence suggests that interruption is really fast. And then what you have, like in the northern hemisphere, think of it this way. You have the first freeze of the year. The planet goes into ice age cold, and then winter lasts for 15,000 years. And now every year, precipitation, you've got the snow onto the land, then that's building up into ice. As the pressure of the overlying snowpack increases, it compresses the layers at the bottom, first through a transitional phase called firn, F-I-R-N, and then it transforms into glacial ice. This, like during the late glacial maximum, lasted for perhaps 15,000 years. And then all of a sudden, it just suddenly, like the god said, time to get rid of this. And so over a series of great pulses of melting, the ice cap was essentially destroyed, and that water was introduced back into the ocean basins. We can see, in fact, I might even have it handy, where there are aerial photographs of Hudson Bay where you can see shorelines that are now elevated like 1,000 feet above sea level. And that shows how much the land has risen when that overlying ice was removed. And just like you said, Jimmy, when you reintroduce that ice into the ocean basins, there has to be a corresponding movement downward. Because what's happening, Jimmy, is the geoid is trying to have everything consistent. So if you move one place, it has to be a compensatory movement somewhere else. Just like you said, I mean, you had it, you nailed it, you got it perfectly. And that is what's happening to the planet. And I think that goes a long way to explaining some of the phenomena. For example, there is, when you press the ice down like this in the center, like if you look at where the center of the greatest thickness of ice was, that is the deepest basin under the ice, and that is now occupied by Hudson Bay.
And also, if you look at the United States, and I've thought about this a lot, Randall, you've got the Smoky Mountains, you've got the Rocky Mountains, and you've got like 2,000 miles of flat plain in the middle that looks like it was leveled out by ice at one point. There's no mountains, it's flat, right? And water. And now if we think about it in those terms at that time, is that the flood myth that is part of every culture on this planet? Is that what they were referring to?
Interesting question. Of course, you've got a very old mountain range, eastern United States, the Appalachians, to use the local pronunciation, the Appalachians, which I think go back to, early or late Paleozoic, I think, in origin, which means they're a couple of 100 million years old. Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevadas, Cascades, by contrast, are very young mountains. The difference is that in the young mountains, you've got, you see the sharp peaks, the angular rocks, things like that, but you don't see the kind of more rounded off nubs like you see in the eastern Appalachians or, say, in the Ozarks. Ozarks are old as well. So they've been eroded. Now, if you look at the Appalachians, in these millions of years of erosion, you had erosion to the east and you had erosion to the west. In other words, if you're removing material from those original mountains that were on the scale of the Rockies or the Sierra Nevadas, it's got to end up somewhere, right? To the east, it formed what is called the Piedmont of the foot slopes. The like where I live is on the Piedmont. So you have this transition of these geomorphic landforms. You have the Appalachian highlands, then you have the Piedmont, and then the Piedmont transitions into the coastal plain. Now, the coastal plain is mostly ancient marine deposits. If you look at a map, you'll see that there's a zone, it runs through Macon, Georgia, here south of where I live, and it's a pretty distinct transition. It's called the fall line. That fall line represents the transition between the Piedmont, which is composed of sediments washed off of the formation of the Appalachians, and ancient high sea level stands. That, in other words, sea level at one point came up to that fall line, which means that large portions of the southeast were at that point, underwater. I could pull up Google Earth here and actually see what the elevation is. You didn't have to raise sea levels a whole lot. But so you had those three. You had the highlands, the uplands of the mountains that washed away, formed the Piedmont, and then you had oceans that's repeatedly risen to that level, a transgression, and then followed by a regression. Now, during the late glacial maximum, because there was so much ice on the land surface, sea levels were lowered globally by at least 400 feet. Now, think about this, Jimmy. If you're lowering sea level, what's happening to the shoreline?
It's exposed.
It's exposed, and the coastline is moving. It's migrating. So during what we call regressions of the sea is lowering, the coastline is migrating seaward. As the transgression, or the rise of sea level, now the coastline is moving inland. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Right.
So we can actually, for example, find ancient corals that are high and, remnants of ancient corals that are high and dry, now 50 feet above sea level, which tells us one of two things. Either the sea was up or the land was down. And it can be either one or both. Now, when you had that massive ice weight over North America, and it depresses like this, what happens to the rim? Let me see if I can do it with my hands here. Depresses in the middle. Here's what happens with the rim. The glacial forebulge, it's called. And that can actually amount to hundreds of feet, where the land has just been lifted up. Whereas in the center, it's squashed down. Around the rim, it's lifted up. And then when that weight is removed, the land in the middle comes up and the forebulge relaxes and subsides back down. So what this is telling us, Jimmy, is that as we look back now into the history of this planet, compared to the models we had of planetary change a half a century to a century ago, you remember how much continental drift met with tremendous amount of resistance. Because why? Because the early 20th century model was of a fixed planet that only changed very minutely and incrementally at a given time. They were so invested in this model that they did not even want to accept the fact that the tectonic plates may move laterally a few centimeters a year. That model now is just completely obsolete, and we know that the planet we live on is tremendously dynamic in many ways.
Continental drift it was fought all the way up to 1955. This is recent history.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't really begin showing up in the textbooks until the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, so let me ask you this, Randall. If we take all of this into consideration, going back to the flood myths and Plato and everything else, that if we had that kind of glacial melting, which happened in a time scale of a pretty, almost overnight, that the sea level rise didn't just happen here. It happened in the Mediterranean, had to rise, right?
Yes.
Where Cairo is today, and the eastern side of the Mediterranean, I'm talking about Lebanon and Jerusalem and all of that, they had to experience crazy flooding, right? And Persia and everything else because of what was happening.
Now, I think that there are three ways that we can account for these catastrophic floods. In the northern United States, we have gigantic floods that are directly the result of very rapid melting of the ice sheet. Direct flows, I mean, we're talking tsunami scale magnitudes of flows coming off of those ice sheets.
Hundreds of miles an hour.
Well, again, depends on the gradient. Now, if it's coming off, now think of the ice sheet as a big dome. If that melting is coming from the center of that dome and it's moving with very little friction or resistance over the steep gradient of the ice sheet itself, what a glaciologist refers to as, I'm going to teach you a new word, supraglacial. Flowing over the top, as say contrasted with subglacial flowing underneath. It is very possible, Jimmy, that supraglacial flows could achieve those types of velocities. Once it hits the land, though, now you're not looking at the same type of a gradient, but you have tremendous flows, say down meltwater flows down the central United States that ultimately carved the Mississippi River Valley. Those flows were giant, but they were relatively slow because it's a shallow gradient and it's over 1,000 miles to get from the ice sheet margin to the Gulf of Mexico. By contrast, go up to Washington State in the Channel Scablands, and now you're going from 2,000 to 3,000 feet above sea level down to sea level in a couple of hundred miles. So now that water is going to be moving a whole lot faster.
Yeah, it's moving.
Its erosive potential is many times greater. Now, we can look at the Mississippi Valley. I mean, I could pull up. I've got Google Maps right here. Can I pull that up and we look at something real quick?
Yeah, you can. Can I ask you a dumb question?
Yeah, I mean, so far, I mean, most of our no, yeah, sure. Go ahead. Ask me a dumb. I might give you a dumb answer, but
was Devil's Tower in Wyoming once an island?
I don't know about that. What I do know about Devil's Tower is it's a volcanic diatreme of very dense basalt rock, and it was once the top of Devil's Canyon was once the surface of the ground.
See, okay. Now we're kind of thinking along the same ways. In that, and this is what, when you drive around, it doesn't matter if it's Utah, even New Mexico, or certainly head across Arizona, and you see what appears to be, as I look off right here in the Mojave Desert, I see it, that I'm wondering if I'm driving on a seabed, because I can see layers off in the distance, and it looks like that was all underwater. And those peaks that I see, when you see trees on the top of that, maybe those were islands at one point, and this was all ocean.
Well, yes, there have been, I mean, now we're getting into the, the deep history of the geology of the planet, because there have been, the great mid-continental seaway that was back here in Cretaceous times. Yeah, the key here is limestones. If the terrain was underwater, you should look for the type of rock that forms in water, and that's limestones. And so if the bedrock is limestone, you know that at some time there was an ocean there. Now, if you look at a mountain range and there are limestones at 10,000 feet, you know that those limestones were once below sea level, and that the land has lifted up that much. So yeah, you're definitely on the right track. I mean, I see a potential geologist coming out of the.
See, the thing is, and once the shifts of landmass started to get accepted in the 1950s, you're right, textbooks, 1960s, 1965, that before that, to think that everything was static, right? And that's what was taught, and that was the mindset. Now we know that certainly isn't the case. Mm-hmm. So that opens the door with, did Antarctica move there? What did happen with something like Atlantis? What was Greenland always where it was? Was the United States and Europe connected? Was South America and Africa one continent at one point? How did Australia get to where it was? These are questions that we have to have. And were there civilizations back then, a couple of 100 million years ago?
Okay, now, in regard to that, I'm open to anything that you can present me, the evidence. You cited a bunch of different things that actually invoke multiple timescales. The drifting apart of say, North America and Europe, South America and Africa almost certainly occurred as a part of continental drift. But this would have been something that we're going back 100 million years. Now, I've seen at this point no convincing evidence for a human presence or the presence of civilization on Earth 100 million years ago. There are anomalies. I'm not convinced that the again, it goes back to the Occam's razor principle. Yes, there looks like what could be an artifact and is found in an ancient coal seam. So my first explanation would, obviously, is it an artifact actually, or does it just have the appearance of an artifact? And if it's an artifact, is there a way we could put that artifact in that particular strata without it having actually been deposited there at the same time the strata was? My thoughts about that is that given the dynamic nature of a catastrophic planet, there are multiple ways you can jumble up things of vastly different age, right? In the old static models where, you might have an area slowly eroded down and another area slowly built up, everything is going to be it's going to be consistent with the time schedule that it's associated with, right? The time frame. So what's going to happen then, though, in a catastrophe is that nice sequential array of deposits can be completely disrupted. And so therefore, I would be very cautious about assuming that something that looks to be 100 million years old that resembles a human artifact is in fact that, without asking a lot of questions first. The second thing is that things do keep getting older and older. I mean, I've just recently been looking at some studies for the early seafaring capabilities. It is now looking like there was seafaring abilities going back over 400,000 years. I remember in making Atlantis presentations, people were, some of the critics and the skeptics were talking, well, it's islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But we can show that islands in the Mediterranean were inhabited tens of thousands, if not 100,000 years ago or longer, which meant that somebody, hominids of some kind, maybe modern humans, maybe even there's evidence that Neanderthals had seafaring capabilities now emerging. Because how do you get Neanderthal remains on an island, right? They had to get there some way, and it's too far to swim. So you assume that they came in a boat. Well, it's not a huge leap to go from there to, the sailing time from Portugal to the Azores is about 10 days. So if we've had the capability of navigating at least over several hundred miles, going back 100,000 years, why is it such a stretch to think that it's completely out of the question that some ancestors of ours 20 or 30,000 years ago could have navigated west of the Straits of Gibraltar and made landfall on, and if it's a late glacial maximum, the route is actually somewhat shorter. The islands are much bigger. Isostatic compensation requires absolutely that the ocean bottom along that mid-Atlantic ridge would be higher because of for one thing, you've done two things. You've removed weight from the ocean and you've added it over the continents. There's nothing so out of the question or fringe or that kind of thinking that would exclude the possibility of somebody navigating to those islands and discovering that during the challenges of a world that's locked into an ice age, we know from paleobotanical studies of the Gulf Stream and many other things that particular complex in that particular region of the ocean would have been actually one of the most benign places and pleasant places to live on Earth during the ice ages. So why is it so out of the question to these academics that they immediately are so derisively and contemptuously dismissive of any thought of Atlantis, like they were in the attacks on Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse recently? They were constantly bringing up that as if just the mention of that word is enough to discredit anybody who even mentions it.
You're not allowed to say it. And then now check this out, Randall. Today, just today, addressing your point, there's a press release happened in the south of France. They found in a cave that was occupied 54,000 years ago, bows and arrows. Now, in the same press release, they said, I read this today on my news segment, that previous estimates were bows and arrows in Northern Europe 12,000 years ago. They were first introduced by modern humans. They've just pushed it back 42,000 years, not 42,000 months, right?
I have been believing all along that Paleolithic peoples had bows and arrows. That it was long before the Neolithic. Generally, bows and arrows came along in maybe the Mesolithic, that middle transition, or the early Neolithic. Yeah, I'm both perfectly willing to think that people had been able to invent bows and arrows way back in the Paleolithic times.
Isn't that crazy? 54,000 years ago, to have a modern human develop the concept of stringing up a piece of wood, sharpening, a sharpened stone on an arrow and shooting it. That's a technical civilization.
Yeah, and I don't think that discovery is so abstruse that it couldn't be made over and over again. All you got to do is bend a stick, and realize that the potential energy that's in that bent stick. To think for tens of thousands of years, no humans with the intelligence comparable to our own wouldn't have figured out the next step.
And here's the thing. The skeptics out there and the debunkers that want to, go toe to toe with people like you and myself, exactly. The dogma that they want us to believe is that Stone Age man was until 5000 BC. And up until that point, they were wearing animal skins and digging in the dirt for seeds for food. There is no way that is the case. Certainly, Göbekli Tepe ends that argument right there. But they don't want to have anything to do with it. And now we've got bows and arrows 54,000 years ago, and they're going to fight this one too.
Yeah, and as I was mentioning, navigational skills. Now, if you got navigational skills, there's an implication of a whole of another skill set that goes along with that. Not only being able to build a seaworthy craft, but to be able to handle ocean and wind currents, be able to perhaps navigate by the stars. So right there, if you've got somebody who can sail hundreds of miles across the ocean, well, that implies a level of technical skill that is beyond what the conventional dogmas are willing to accept.
I love that part of it too, because once that line is crossed with intelligence, where you're looking at the star, you're not navigating with the shoreline, right? I get that. A canoe, heck, you can hang on to a log and swim through the water and navigate the shoreline. Once you lose the shoreline, now you're dependent on that right above you. I don't care if it's the moon, the stars, or whatever, but you've got a basic grasp of longitude and latitude to get you in a direction.
So this is from a paper that just came out this month, and it's entitled Archaic Hominins Maiden Voyage in the Mediterranean Sea. And here's what the abstract says. When archaic hominins started sea crossings, and whether or not seas were barriers to their dispersal is highly debated. This paper attempts to provide insights into these issues, focusing on the Aegean Sea. The study shows that the central Aegean island chain was insular, meaning they were islands, from the surrounding land masses over the last 450,000 years, and contests previously available Aegean Sea paleogeography. I'm going to skip over some of it, but basically the conclusion of it is that here we go. Paleolithic assemblages. So this is in the margin of the Mediterranean Sea implies that pre-sapiens as early as 450,000 years before present were sea crossing the Aegean Sea. A. B. Were encouraged by the favorable land seascape configuration to attempt these sea crossings. And C. To spread to the circum-Mediterranean basin sourcing from the Levant, following two converging routes, the one via the Aegean Sea and the other the Bosporus land bridge, and the other via Gibraltar Straits. So in other words, what that is saying is that they had sailed all over the Mediterranean Sea from one end, from the eastern end to the western end by 450,000 years ago.
Now, is that even for somebody like you or me, is that pushing things, or are you okay? Is that still in?
No, that's, for me, that's pushing things from not what I would have been willing to speculate, but what I would have derived based it upon the studies I've seen so far, which would suggest 50 to 70,000 years ago. Although, because that's typically when the occupation of, say, Australia took place, around 50,000 years ago. So that implied that at least by then, people were able to navigate across the ocean.
Randall, let's take our break, because when we come back, I want to continue where we are. I do want to talk about transoceanic cultures, and I want to talk about symbols and symbolism associated with that. So let's take our break. This is Fade to Black. We'll be right back. This is Jimmy Church of Fade to Black. Please visit all of our sponsors. We're taking a quick break here. All of the links are below. We'll be right back. Check out Billy Carson's Forbidden Knowledge. ForbiddenKnowledge.com or ForbiddenKnowledge.tv, where you can get access to over 6,000 videos, movies, TV series, exclusive documentaries like the Black Knight Satellite. You can do it all for just $7.77 per month or $77 per year after the 3-day trial, which is also totally free to check out. It's all simple to do. Billy Carson is the best. It's simple. ForbiddenKnowledge.com or ForbiddenKnowledge.tv. That's the number 4BK. On Saturday, April 1st, that's right, April Fool's Day, 2023, I will be hosting the Parapod Festival at the Hyatt Regency right here in Valencia, California. It's a live one-day podcast awards. It's a film festival. It's a full-on media event. We're going to have sky watching. There's going to be a Lifetime Achievement Award presented to Linda Moulton Howe. Right now, you can submit your podcast, your film, your TV series, any of your paranormal media for consideration. You can do all of that on the links below. For info and tickets, go to parapodfilmfest.com. That's parapodfilmfest.com. April 7th through the 14th, 2023, I'll be hosting and presenting on the Hidden Secrets Seminar at Sea Cruise. From Los Angeles to the Mexican Riviera on the Navigator of the Seas. That's right, up top, a giant water slide. You've got to check out the Navigator of the Seas. It's amazing. We've got Scott Walter, Adam Apollo, Nick Pope, Brad Olson, Vivian Chauvet, Jason Shirka, Robert Grant, Ruben Langdon, and another 12 amazing speakers and presenters. It's all simple to do. Just visit divinetravels.com/Hidden Secrets 2023. You know you want to go on a cruise with me. River Moon Coffee, makers of the Fade to Black blend. Truly the best coffee on planet Earth. Just visit rivermoonwellness.com or their Amazon store. It's all simple to do. You can check out the Fade to Black blend, the Game Changer blend, or any of their Black Moon wellness products. It's the only coffee I drink. It is the best, and it's Doc. Again, rivermoonwellness.com. All right. Welcome back. Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. I was just looking at the chat there, and somebody said Chris Holmes wants his guitars back. I've known Chris, since we were kids. I think I first met him, first time he was at my house. It was in the mid-'80s. and just been really, really close friends with him. Haven't seen him in a while. He moved to Europe, and he's been over there. But I don't have any of his guitars, though. I should have got one back in the day, but I didn't. But I spent many nights with Chris Holmes. Our guest tonight is watching his studio. Okay, now I'm back. That was weird. I've never seen that happen. Okay, so anyway, Randall built this new studio, and when we were together a few months ago, he was just finishing it and showing me the photographs of the construction and the progress of it. And looking at it today, it is absolutely beautiful. So this is where he does his podcast from, and you can go. I think I've got links below for Randall and his website, and you can check out his new podcast that he is currently doing. All right, I'm still waiting for Randall to come back, and there you go. What I was going to say. Oh, okay. So here's the deal. When Randall comes back, Randall's a Freemason. He's been a Freemason for 30 plus years. And he understands symbols and symbolism, and of course geometry, and how all of that applies to everything. And the ability to look at something and identify it, and you retain that knowledge, and then you're exploring the world, and you're seeing something, and then you notice something somewhere else, and it shouldn't exist. Now, from what he has just said to me, and I've often wondered about this, and I think we all have, if we are talking about transoceanic, boats, and a way to do this up to 450,000 years ago, which is a crazy number. It's a crazy thought. That did they carry not only languages and trade, but written languages and those symbols that started to stretch across the world. And we can talk about, say, the purses, right? There's something that sits out right there that I just wonder about these things. And when we look at some of, the Gosford glyphs in Australia, and you look at the symbolism by the Mayans and the Aztecs, and everywhere over Central and South America, and the comparisons, even Sumerian Sanskrit in Central and South America. How did it get there all the way from the Persian Gulf? It doesn't make any sense. How did it get there from Iraq and Mesopotamia? Unless there was a culture that had the ability to do that. So that's what we're going to talk about next when Randall gets here. And I'm still waiting for Randall. Oh, man, this is great. This is great. Now, what he was talking, let me jump back. I'm glad that I actually have this opportunity to talk. What I was holding up earlier, this is a hacky sack. It's an alien hacky sack that I have. But it's a really good demonstrator of the displacement of Earth when something happens. So when you squeeze it, something else is going to move, right? And so when we're talking about the Earth, that's what's going on. I was taught in school, this was in 8th grade, and we had a class called Indiana History. I took it at Belzer Junior High School on the north side of Indianapolis. Here's Randall. He's back. And so I'm in this class, Randall. I'm talking about how I learned about the glaciers over North America.
Okay.
And I'm in Indiana history class in 8th grade, and my teacher at that time says, and he says this to the class, and it was I think I mentioned this to you over lunch. You may remember the conversation, but he says to the class, remember, I'm 12 years old, right? He goes, Indiana had two miles of ice above it. He goes, everybody look up. And so we look up, and he goes, now imagine 2 miles of ice, right? And now when you say that to a 12-year-old, you're like, what? You can't even have a concept. And what he had said to us, and it was something that I was taught, I learned this, and I never forgot it, all the way to our conversation that we're having tonight, Randall. He said, half of Indiana is flat. Half of it is hilly. That's where the glacier stopped, and it leveled out. And now it's a very basic way to teach and stuff, but you never forget that. And so now when you're driving around Indiana, as I'm getting older and I'm in the flat part of Indiana, then you go into the hilly part, I immediately start thinking about what my 8th grade teacher had said to me, and I start to picture everything that was up and above us and this glacial mass that was once over the top of North America. And that's what you do. You learn this, you don't forget it, and then I have a conversation with you later, and it confirms what I've always just contemplated and thought about growing up, what was over the top of the United States. So we ended before the break. We were talking about transoceanic cultures, and you brought up this number of 450,000 years ago. You're a Freemason. You've been a Freemason for over 30 years. And 40 years. I'm trying to make you sound young. Okay.
About 45 years, actually. Yeah.
45 years. You understand symbols. You know, when you see something in one country or one state and you travel somewhere else and you notice something similar, you're going to pick that up and think about it because this is something that you study. Is it possible that these symbols that are seen around the world are because of exactly what you're talking about? We don't make an association of something Egyptian in Australia, not necessarily, but if there were things cruising around the Mediterranean and making these adventures happen, that the symbolism and languages and trade could have happened worldwide way before we thought it could?
Well, yes, and I think that is something we need to be open to, that possibility. That, we could have been looking at circumnavigation of the globe, millennia before Magellan, and, it seems that scholarship and academics get so locked into their models that it almost, the old saying about, how new scientific knowledge is finally accepted is when the old guard passes away. There seems to be some of that. There is occasionally an apostasy where somebody goes, okay, you know what, I have to change my way of thinking. And it's just too bad, though, that there's not more of that. But yeah, I think that, again, this goes back to the term I said earlier, geomythology or astromythology, which is using symbols to represent natural processes. Although they're natural processes that are outside the scope of our present perception, just because they haven't happened in our time, during which, we've had scientific documentation of natural phenomena. So what we have is cultural interpretations of natural phenomena that could come down to us through the medium of symbols. And as soon as we begin to recognize that behind these symbols, it gets back to that conversation we had in the first part. Once you get to the reality behind the symbols, and you're asking, okay, well, what does this represent? So at that point, I think that, number one, yes, I think we're seeing symbols that are an indication of natural phenomena, and also symbols that could point to the existence of an ancient technology.
How is it possible that the plateau of Giza was so perfectly, I don't care what the time scale is, if it's 5,000 years ago or if the Great Pyramid's 50,000 years old, it doesn't matter to me.
Right.
But it is still perfectly level, and it's perfectly square and orientated north, that nothing is shifted, nothing. So it's obviously earthquake and natural disaster proof, as well as all of the other fantastic things that are associated with its construction. How is it possible that Stone Age man did this 5,000 years ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the question, isn't it? No, I definitely think that we need to be considering the possibility that there are ancient technologies and scientific knowledge that has been lost. And, mainstream academia seems so adverse to that idea. I don't know if it's because of a kind of a narcissism or what it is to acknowledge or accept, even as a working hypothesis, that there may have been things that that ancient people knew that we have forgotten and maybe not even rediscovered. We certainly saw that in the attacks on Graham Hancock, on Ancient Apocalypse. This idea that we could actually devote a whole show to just debunking the debunkers. And I don't know how much you've seen of that, but they totally divert the facts and the legitimate questions that Graham brought to the table by getting into all of this dangerous conspiracy theories, that he's promoting white supremacism, racism, all of that kind of stuff. And when you think about it, Jimmy, now I've gone through about 8 or 10 of the so-called debunkings by the critics, some from professional academics within the profession, others from journalists who I presume are getting their talking points from these academics. But in 8 or 10 different critiques of Ancient Apocalypse, over and over again, you saw the same words, the same phraseology. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, wait a minute. Now, okay, I look at it, and most of the people that I know watched it, and whether you did or didn't, but
I did.
Okay, so where in there now, Jimmy? Let me ask you this question: if you watch that, are you going to come away from that thinking Graham Hancock's a white supremacist?
No.
But how can it be that 10 people independently, journalists and academics, watched it and all came away saying that he's promoting white supremacy?
Well, so that's what you do, right? You attack the individual, but you don't attack the subject matter, and you try to discredit him that way. And certainly, going into what zone really offends people? White supremacist, right?
Well, yeah. So, but here's my point, though. My point is yes, it's a huge red herring. It's an argument from sort of like the reverse of an argument from authority, and a bunch of them said that. Well, who are you going to believe, Graham Hancock or me? I'm a real archaeologist, right? Well, here's the thing. I don't think that these people all read that and honestly came away with the impression that Graham's a white supremacist. I think that what we're seeing here is evidence that they're all reading from the same script, or at least the same talking points, because you can't tell me that you're independently, these people are going to they may have grave objections to the ideas, but where do you derive from there that this is promoting white supremacy? It's not there. So it had to have come from somewhere, though, and you're not going to get all of these critics uniformly invoking white supremacy unless they're reading from the same script, which then raises the question in my mind of what's the origin of this script?
Okay, this is the problem with anybody that wants to step up and say, I'm a geologist, I know what I'm talking about. I'm an archaeologist, I'm an anthropologist, I know what I'm doing. He's not. The problem with that is going back to our conversation about continental drift, right? Mm-hmm. That was completely argued, and we talk about Galileo. Okay, and we talk about that too as well, and Copernicus. So as soon as you are outside of the accepted box that you're supposed to remain in, suddenly you're crazy town, and they're going to attack you and fight this. The reason why continental drift is accepted today is because somebody, and this went on for a couple of 100 years. I mean, the last push was 1955, 1958, but it was fought. And the reason why it is here today, the reason why the sun is at the center of our solar system is because somebody thought outside of the box that they were supposed to be locked into. So when an anthropologist or an archaeologist or some historian or geologist is going to fight this, I'm like, what happened to you? What happened to your profession? You're supposed to ask questions and think differently. Science is nothing but, Randall, a series of corrections. That's all it is. It's a series of somebody was wrong at one point and was corrected. A physicist today, his algorithms that they're working on are going to be modified and disproven in the future, right? They're going to be wrong. And that's just the way science works. So when I hear that argument today, if I'm going to counter, that's what I'm going to counter with. Or, I felt bad for Graham. Graham definitely got into a defensive posture. I don't know if he needed to do that, and you want to fight your critics, right? I get that. But maybe you just shut up and let these idiots sound stupid all on their own, and you don't have to defend yourself. All you're doing is thinking outside of the box and asking questions. And I'm not wrong in that.
Right. And that's essentially what he was doing. And a couple of things that I've written and said about that, I'm saying, it's kind of like the moral of the Holy Grail story, which is that, Percival or whoever the protagonist was is out on this multi-year quest for the Grail, which is the only thing, which is the antidote to healing not only the ailing king, but the wasteland. And he comes upon the Fisher King, this mysterious fisherman fishing in the river, who guides him to the Castle Corbenic, where he goes and sees this sumptuous display because he lets the Fisher King know that he's on this quest for the Grail. So he goes to the castle and he's treated, like royalty. He's led into a gigantic, great banquet hall. He's seated down with sumptuous food brought before him. And then there's this pageant that proceeds to unfold in front of him of, these young men and maidens carrying these various objects, a maiden including a resplendent grail. And you go through this, and he's having these incredible experiences looking at the presentation of this symbolism that is occurring in front of his eyes. And he's got all kind of, what is this? What does this mean? I know everything tells me, every cell in my body tells me that there's a meaning here, but what is this meaning? He did not answer the question, because when he first began to set out on his quest, note the connection between the word quest and question, right? Because when you ask questions, that's what leads you on the quest, right? For the truth, for reality. So when he was beginning his quest, he apprenticed under an old knight who told him and basically inculcated him in the idea that he shouldn't speak frivolously. He should mostly mind his tongue and listen acutely, but not to be given into lots of chatter and discussion and talk and stuff, because that is not the nature of a knight to do that. So he's remembering this admonition of the old knight while he's seeing all of this, and it makes him hesitate to ask the questions that seem to be so begging to be asked. Well, then it's over with, and he goes to sleep, and he wakes up. The whole castle is abandoned, looking like as if it had not even been occupied in centuries. It's, instead of resplendently decorated with sumptuous, curtains and carvings and people filled with life and food everywhere and merriment, it's completely abandoned. It's dark, spider webs and dust. And so he gets up and he wanders out, and it's still the wasteland. And this old hag comes shrieking at him, accusing him of really being stupid, because you just sat there and they presented this whole panorama to you designed so that you would ask the fundamental questions of what this means. And in the answers to those questions, you would have understood the Grail, and you would have been able to heal the king and the wasteland. But now, because you sat there without saying something, the wasteland is going to continue on. The king is not going to get well, And that was sort of the whole moral of the story. Yes, it's good to bide your tongue, but there are times when you really need to ask questions. And my whole point about what I took, my takeaway from so much that we see going on now, and this was manifest in Ancient Apocalypse, is that no, we're not allowed anymore to ask questions if those questions may challenge the prevailing dogmas and paradigm. And what that really tells me, Jimmy, is that these people, these defenders of the orthodoxy, are really getting desperate. They're getting desperate because they've concocted a whole house of cards over the last few decades that encompasses all of so much that we've seen come down. And I'm not going to get off into the COVID and Russian collusion, and we could start a list and it would go on and on and on.
Yeah.
But there's this whole narrative that's been concocted and is now being pushed down our throats through various means, whatever you want to call it, but it's like a multi-headed monster. It's pervading academia and our schools and the corporatocracy and the government, but it's all very flimsy. It's the whole construct is a house of cards. And interestingly, in some of the debunkings that I saw, and I could actually, I won't pull them up now, but in some of the written stuff I've done, I've actually quoted saying that if you accept these dangerous conspiracy theories that are being promoted by white supremacist Graham Hancock, well, you might believe that doctors are lying to you, or you might believe that politicians are lying to you. And I said, yeah, there's the rub right there. There it is.
I read that, and I was completely offended by it. And here you talk about a rub. Here's the real rub, that up until 1991, 1992, the dogma, I keep saying dogma because, man, you repeat something enough, people just believe it, right? And it doesn't matter where it comes from or what it's about. But the dogma in history was that there was nothing before Egypt or Mesopotamia. 3000 BC was it. There's no discussion here. You guys are cranks and crackpots, right? And that what happens? Gobekli Tepe happens 7,000 years before Giza. 12,000 years ago, we've got Gobekli Tepe, and it may be even much older than that, but let's just go with that number. And that wasn't enough to change things. It wasn't. Oh, that's an anomaly. That Stone Age man, that was actually pretty clever. No, dude, that's 7,000 years before Giza. So don't change the story now. But that's an example of that. You can give them, like Graham Hancock with these skeptics, you turn around, whether it's Gadam Padang or any of these areas that appear to be much older, you turn around and you present something like Gobekli Tepe, and that's not good enough. The skeptics, their answer is, nah. That's it. That's all that they have to go on. Nah. They don't counter with anything.
Well, yeah, that's it. And if you read the attacks on Ancient Apocalypse, as I have line by line, taking them apart and looking at them line by line, it's what strikes you is the absence of anything substantial. There's nothing there. That's why they have their fallback strategy is name calling and red herrings and every logical fallacy in the book.
I know Graham, Graham, and he's got a very strong personality. And that's what I love and enjoy about him. He doesn't bend. He's out there asking questions, and he's not going to tap out. I don't know why the attacks on him. What did they expect Graham to do? He's not the guy to tap out. He's not that guy. They're attacking the wrong guy. Well, he's not going to tap out.
To characterize it all that he's being mean-spirited and it's like, see, now they're playing the victim here. That's what they're doing. Oh, we're being attacked unfairly by Graham Hancock. Well, no, that's BS. I mean, they've been heaping abuse upon him for decades now. Now, that he gets annoyed and fights back. Oh, now suddenly they're the victims, and that comes through very clearly
Right.
in the crap that they wrote in the aftermath of Ancient Apocalypse. It's absurd. It's almost a comedy in a way, but you know, there are implications here. The implications are that there's organized cabals of people that don't want the rest of us to ask questions.
And what's the danger in that, though? You know, I mean, I want to hear your answer. What is the danger? What are they so afraid of? I mean, even in the Catholic Church and the Vatican with Galileo, what was it that they were so afraid of? It doesn't change anything, right? It doesn't. Nothing changes. We're just learning and moving forward. What's the danger of asking questions?
I think that it probably gets down to ultimately politics, but, you know, the idea that we have these entrenched hierarchies of authority, you know, and if, you know, hey, I am the tenured archaeologist here. Who are you going to believe, me or Graham Hancock? Now, the bizarre thing to me is like, oh, the experts say this and that. They constantly make these references to in the attacks on Ancient Apocalypse, constantly make references to the experts, right? And I'm thinking, okay, and then one of the experts is this British archaeologist. I'll cite him as an example, right? He's done, you know, some studies on I think it was, Greece and maybe Roman age, Bronze Age Rome. I forget exactly, but, you know, you can, for example, as an archaeologist or a geologist, you can take one strata or one outcrop or one site, and you can spend years studying that one site. Like I know somebody who's an archaeologist that has spent years studying Civil War sites. Now, he can tell you all kinds of details and things about, you know, whatever, maybe what happened at the Battle of Bull Run and so forth. And he's a degreed archaeologist. Does that automatically make him an expert on the Paleolithic? No. Now, take Graham. What has he done? For more than 30 years, he's traveled to probably close to 100 countries. He's read thousands of scientific papers. He's interviewed probably hundreds of experts, authorities, scientists, scholars, academics, ranging all the way from the fringe point of view to the you know, entrenched orthodoxy and everything in between. Now, so he's been studying these questions of pre-cataclysmic civilization, the cataclysms themselves, and so on. The fact of the matter is that when it comes down to looking at the Younger Dryas transition and the millennia that preceded that and what may or may not have happened, Graham Hancock is the expert. He knows far more about this than the people that are coming on board and, you know, oh, who are you going to believe? Graham Hancock or the real archaeologist, me? Well, it's laughable, Jimmy. It is laughable. The simple fact is that nobody's going to know more about that than Graham himself. He is the expert, right? So now they're bringing in these people who probably know only marginally about the things that Graham's been investigating for 30 years. And they're being, you know, trucked in to become the debunkers. And it's to anybody who is thinking, who has a little bit of a knowledge and awareness about these things, it's laughable. It's so absurd and utterly superficial and without substance. But given the climate, the intellectual climate in America today anyway, you know, we've, you know, since you and I were young, Jimmy, things have dumbed down a lot. The status of education in this country has gone into serious decline. And, you know, we're getting kids coming out of high school and going into college now that have basically no comprehension of history or the scientific method or critical thinking, any of that kind of stuff. And it's sad, but somehow there has to be a correction in a course correction somewhere very soon.
When we just go with the accepted, it's not my timeline, but if we go with the accepted Egyptologist timeline that is in the books, then the Great Pyramid and that complex, which, you know, we can go to the Bent Pyramid and we can go to Saqqara and Dashur and talk about it. But the accepted timeline is 2700 BC, right?
Mm-hmm.
2750 for the bent pyramid, you know what I mean, going up to 2650. It's a 100-year period when they did all of that construction. But that's not what is important here. What is important is 500 miles south of Giza and Saqqara and Dashur is Aswan. And inside of the Great Pyramid are 70 to 100 ton, and there's 70 to 100 of the relieving stones above in the relieving chambers above the great the King's Chamber.
King Chamber.
Those were 100-ton blocks, 100 tons. So you're telling me that 5,000 years ago they had the technology, barely on the cusp of the Bronze Age, by the way. I mean, metallurgy was just started, but that they transported and carved those from a red granite quarry in Aswan and transported those somehow to Giza. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't fit the timeline that they are giving us. It doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. Now, I don't know what the answers are, but I'm going to continue to ask those questions, just like Graham has and you, because what they're telling us doesn't work. They dragged them through the Sahara Desert on sleds. And they didn't even have any trees, by the way. Right? They didn't have any trees. The cedar came from Lebanon.
The barges, is, I think now probably the dominant idea that they were transported along the Nile on barges, but I think we could find objections to that.
Well, okay, so let's stop right there. I like that point. 100-ton displacement barge.
Right.
That's 3,000 BC. Somebody give me evidence of that, because that's a big-ass boat.
Yeah, and it seems to me, again, I haven't done the in-depth studies, but my first question would be, what is the displacement from a 100-ton stone, and what is the depth of the Nile, and how large of a barge would you have to have? And what strikes me is that my instincts tell me that you're going to have a lot of problems with that.
When you go to Aswan, and you're a rock star, you deal with rocks, right? And I love red granite. I do. I love the way it looks and its density and the way it feels, and when it's carved and smoothed, there's nothing pretty. I love red granite. But you go to Aswan and you see that unfinished obelisk, right, which is 175 feet long, right? Estimates of 2,500 tons. And it's sitting there in the quarry where all the other red granite obelisks were carved and all the other blocks. But the point is, somebody thought that they could move that thing. Right? It's in the ground now, but they had plans to get it up and out of that pit. What? What?
Yeah. How in the hell are you going to even get that thing out of the pit?
How you may be able to float that thing. I don't know what Merlin, what magic. I don't know. But they weren't doing it with papyrus ropes and chicken.
And this gets us back to again something that I have questioned for years. As you look at ancient cultures all over the world, we find that same kind of evidence of ancient cultures moving very stupendous weights, mostly large stones, but all around. We find them, in Egypt, we find them in megalithic Europe, we find them in South America, in many other places. We find that people were, all throughout the Middle East, people were able to apparently move large stones with impunity. And here's the question you got to ask, Jimmy, and I'm sure you've asked this question. If you've got a civilization that's nomadic, that it's, say, hunter-gatherers or subsistence farmers or some combination thereof, where are they going to find the time and the motive to quarry 50-ton rocks and move them and set them up in these astronomically oriented symbolical structures? If you're a subsistence farmer and you want to know the seasons, you don't need to create a henge of 50-ton boulders. All you need is a damn stick in the ground with a circle around it. And you can make a nice accurate calendar to know the seasons, and then all you have to do also on top of that is just particularly watch stars. When do the Pleiades rise each year? Now that's going to be a certain season. It's going to be, the autumn season, and the Pleiades are rising. So, and you're living in a culture where, there are no electric lights, presumably, or you have, complete darkness at night. You can really see the stars vividly, and you're watching those. So you, just by watching the stars and simple things like putting a stick in the ground, you don't need these gigantic stones. What is the motive there, and what is the purpose? And okay, let's suppose that one culture as an anomaly decides, hey, we're going to just really work our butts off and carve these huge stones and set them up as a proxy astronomical observatory. Okay, maybe. But then all over the world, multiple cultures independently decide to do this. It just doesn't make sense.
No, and then there is the answer to me. You said Occam's razor earlier. The answer to me is probably the simplest one. There was just an advanced culture before what we know or understand. Maybe the man knows, and they're just not sharing that with us. But that's the simplest answer. There was something there, and somebody was teaching how to do these things. They were teaching how to quarry. They were teaching art. They were teaching geometry.
Yes.
They were teaching astrology and astronomy. And they understood what the constellations were. They understand the cycle of time. They probably, they knew all of these basics, maybe even music and law, right? I mean, and we're teaching this a long time ago. This isn't some part of modern history. That's the simplest answer, and that's the one we fight.
And that is the one that, to me, seems to be the most consistent with Occam's razor. And for one thing, we have the evidence of these cultures themselves talking about. I used to go hiking here in North Georgia a lot. There's a mountain up in North Georgia called Blood Mountain, which has a lot of interesting stories associated with it. But it was a sacred mountain to the Cherokee who once inhabited this area. So there used to be, I don't know, it's probably not there anymore. We're going back, 20, 30 years ago when I used to hike up there. At the trailhead, there was a sign talking about some of the Cherokee history and lore and legends and stuff. And one of the things that it mentioned was that this was a meeting place between the ancestors of the Cherokee and the Nunahai. Who are the Nunahai? Well, it said the Nunahai were the people that could travel anywhere. Exact definition, explanation of the Nunahai. In the Cherokee definition, the people who could travel anywhere, right? Then you go, and in Sumeria, you had the Anunnaki with the same idea. They're outsiders who came in and showed them how to do these things. The same in Egypt with the Osirian and the pantheon of Egyptian gods. I mean, over and over again, you read Isis taught the science of agriculture. We find it in South America, the Viracocha and these outsiders that came in and taught them these skills. We find it in the southwestern deserts, the stories about the Anasazi, the Tuatha, it's hard for me to pronounce, but the Tuatha in the Celtic traditions. Again, all being described as in the same way. They're outsiders who had this knowledge. They came in and they worked with the indigenous peoples. Now, of course, that idea is now what's being proclaimed as racism and white supremacy. But of course, nowhere do we necessarily have to say or even theorize that they were exclusively white or that they were exclusively any color. We don't know. They're not so specific on that, although some of the Central American and South American traditions would suggest that, they had beards. I mean,
they had red hair, but anybody that would bring that up, Randall, is racist.
Well, yeah, that's what they say. This is how they get around this by calling names. Now, and here's the thing: going back to the idea of a periodic catastrophes in the history of the Earth, talking about how these catastrophes have affected the history of the Earth, but then extrapolating from there and asking, well, how have these catastrophes affected human civilization? And I think that it is not implausible to say that there could have been an advanced Ice Age culture, and I use the term advanced, without necessarily making any particular implication that they were, using fossil fuels and driving SUVs and computers or anything like that.
Yeah.
Cell phones, right? That I'm not advanced in ways we may not even have begun to guess yet. But it is not, based on what we know now, there's no reason why we categorically exclude any discussion of there being the possibility of an advanced civilization in the Ice Age, or to use the archaic term, an antediluvian civilization that may have had access to scientific knowledge, which we have forgotten, and that some core group was able to survive the events that we now call the Younger Dryas and all of these other things that happened in that period between 11 and, say, 14,000 years ago, in that window of extreme global upheaval. And in the aftermath of that, and Plato actually makes this kind of clear in his dialogues, differentiating between the types of survivors, right? If you have somebody that survives a cataclysm because of foreknowledge and preparedness and being ready for it, as opposed to somebody who survives just because of the luck of the draw, you're going to see a natural division of the human species there. On the one hand, the people that survive by the luck of the draw are going to pretty much be, and Plato makes exactly this point, they're going to be wholly preoccupied with the challenges of survival. Where's our next meal going to come from? How are we not going to freeze to death in the winter? The cultural group that did make those preparations, whatever form that may have taken, the preppers of the day, we are going to preserve as much scientific knowledge, the technology, the traditions, and so on. In the aftermath, after the things have settled down, the dust has settled, it would only be natural that these people would go now out to try to lift the burdens of survival from their fellow human beings by teaching them stuff that has been lost. Now,
that includes some of the very basic things that advanced us very quickly. And I'm talking about the domestication of wheat, agriculture, animals. It's at some point
languages,
because at some point when you're not a culture, it started with an individual, but a culture had to make the decision of, do we worry about the beasts in the night, right? Do we worry about getting eaten, or are we going to apply ourselves in another direction? And I'm telling you, a great example of that, and I think that there are thousands more around the world, is Göbekli Tepe. Because to have Göbekli Tepe to exist, Randall, these are all the basics. You had to have community, you had to have leadership, you had to have engineering, you had to have teaching, you had to have agriculture, you had to have food prep, you had to have clothing, and you had to have the ability to make tools, and obviously some kind of metallurgy, because they carved 3D relief into those stones. So how did that happen at 10,000 BC? Somebody taught them. They didn't dream all of that up at that culture as like day one. No, somebody taught them all of that, and that there isn't another way to look at it.
And my guess, and it's still a guess, but I think it's a guess that's based upon valid thinking and information, and in looking for explanations for some of the unexplained things from our past. I'm pretty much now convinced that many of these ancient efforts, engineering efforts, whether it's in Egypt or whether we're talking, Neolithic or Paleolithic Britain or South America, in Peru and Bolivia and, China, and we could even go into North America. I'll digress for a second and say that about 6 weeks ago, I did a little tour, and I went to a couple of sites, interesting sites. One of the sites I went to is two mounds on the LSU campus in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I went to also Poverty Point, which is in northeastern Louisiana. My third time there. Very, very interesting site.
Yeah, Two Mounds is crazy. It's right there on LSU's campus.
Yes, you're aware of those mounds.
I am. I've checked it out. I've done some research. Yes.
Okay, so I met with what's his name? Kevin Teagues? No, let's see. No. That's at the Bone. I don't remember his name right offhand. It's been a couple of months now. I've got his card right here, as a matter of fact. But anyways, he was an archaeological professor at LSU. And he decided that he was going to do an in-depth analysis of the age of those mounds that apparently had never been accurately dated. So anyhow, the mounds showed up two different ages. I think they were separated by perhaps about 1,500 years. But the older of the two, and we spent about 3 hours with him, we went out, saw the mounds. He took us into his laboratory, showed me his dating protocols and all of that. Like I said, spent about 3 hours with him while he went through the whole process with us. But the older of the two mounds dated to 11,300 years old. And of course, that created a huge controversy, and even his colleagues that he thought were friends of his have actually attacked him personally as a result of that. But he stuck to his guns, and he showed us, went through the whole thing and how the dating came up, and he said, we went through the protocols multiple times before I even published. For your listeners or whatever, I'll be posting links to his papers and things on my website, along with a bunch of other interesting things related to what we've been talking about tonight. But 11,300, that puts it just within centuries of the Younger Dryas, upper Younger Dryas boundary, Göbekli Tepe, the final phase of building there. And at Poverty Point, what I learned, now Graham Hancock went to Poverty Point, and that was in the Netflix series. Mark, I don't remember Mark's last name. He was the lead archaeologist on the site. We got Mark to give us a tour, and it was great. This, like I said, was my third time there. But this time, Mark's, I didn't have the tours the other two times. I was just kind of on my own. So this was, Mark disclosed some new information, which had to do with the creation of Göbekli Tepe. And one of the things that I was unaware of, it sits on the edge of a bayou, and it's like 43 acres or something, the whole complex. And before the construction of this multi-ring structure and the three mounds, including this one very large mound that was probably originally about 80 feet high, the site was irregular and undulating with sinkholes and things like that. So they had to level the site. In order to level that site, they had to bring in places 5 and 6 feet of material, covering like 40 some plus acres. This is an enormous mass of volume of material. It has to be conveyed, perfectly leveled out. And then the three mounds. The interesting thing about the three mounds, and I've known this about mound architecture, is that they're not just heaps of earth piled up. They're very carefully and intentionally layered. And oftentimes the layers are not the same material. They're different. In some cases, the organic component may be higher. In others, the mineral component may be higher. And the big mound at Göbekli Tepe is the same way. It's layered. There was I believe he was a paleobotanist, and I got to get a hold of that paper. I haven't read it since, so this has been a couple of months now since we took the tour. But what Mark was telling me was this paleobotanist, if that's what in fact he was, they took samples through the mound and if you pile up, you've probably seen this, if you go excavate and you put a pile of dirt there, it's not, a month later, there's going to be stuff growing on it, isn't there?
That's right.
There's going to be, by 1 year, you're going to have seedlings coming up. There's going to be trees growing there. Within 3 or 4 or 5 years, there'll be trees growing there, right? Well, if you put a pile of earth there, Jimmy, and then you put another pile of earth on top of it, the longer hiatus there is between the deposition of those two layers, the more organic material in the form of seeds, pollens, actual plant remains and stuff there's going to be sandwiched between those layers, right? Okay. What happens though if you look at those layers and there's nothing? There's no indication of a hiatus. Now there's some organic material, yes, scattered pretty much uniformly through the 80-foot pile, but there's no concentration where the separation, the bedding planes of these layers occurs, as you would expect if there had been a hiatus. So this paleobotanist was looking at this and going, well, the time span over which this huge mound was created had to have been very, very short. And in fact, he estimated between 1 and 3 months.
Really?
Yes. Now, if you create this huge earthen mound over 1 to 3 months, according to the conventional scenarios of, human labor transporting the earth in wicker baskets or whatever.
No wheel, no horse.
Presumably, right? You
Right.
have to presume you had tens of thousands of people working. Now, if you've got tens of thousands of people working, round the clock, somebody else has to be providing them with food, shelter, clothing. Now, based upon population estimates of population density, 4,500. Interestingly, Göbekli Tepe dates to right around the same time as the Great Pyramid conventional dating, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So if you go and you imagine, well, what level of organization and how many people are we talking about? There's a huge disconnect there.
It doesn't make any sense. And if you look at the population numbers for that area back then, it was virtually zero. All right. There wasn't a million people there. And it was the same issues were along the Nile River at 5000 BC. Conventional numbers of the population of Egypt at that time was 500,000 in the entire country. Yeah. So what that tells you, and it's the same problem with Göbekli Tepe, that every single male that could walk in Egypt was building pyramids. Nobody was farming, right? Nobody was building roads. Nobody was building ships. Nobody was in the quarry. Nobody was doing anything but building. There were no armies. If you go with what they suggest, and it would be the same thing in Göbekli Tepe, the very same thing. And they found 12 more tepes, right, around Göbekli Tepe. That throws it off. We didn't even talk about or Urfa, right? And same situation going on there.
Friend, Ben Van Kerkwick?
I do.
Uncharted X, yeah, he's headed over there soon. I believe in March.
Yeah, I've got friends going over in August, and I'm invited. Man, I would love to go. I would love to go. Well,
we've done a little bit of map research and things, and there you can see very clearly on Google Earth the huge quarries.
Well, I wanted to mention, you didn't mention this. Maybe I think you kind of did. Next to Göbekli Tepe, there's evidence of a canal and the transportation of water to the site. There's no natural water sources there. They had to bring the water in. Where does that technology come from at 10,000 BC?
Yeah, that they could build, substantial canals or aqueducts, as the case may be.
I think that's what they called them, was aqueducts.
Yeah, there's so many unanswered questions about our own past on this planet that, it's time to just open the gates and let her rip. It's time to say, okay, we've got to consider all possibilities here. In this business of suppressing things because it doesn't fit your narrowly defined paradigm. No, we don't have time for you anymore.
No, we don't. We don't.
We don't have time for these people anymore.
Let me ask you this, Randall, and thank you for taking the time to come on the show tonight. And we've got to do this again here really soon. And we will. Actually, Randall and I have got plans for 2023, and we'll announce those. But would it surprise you if the ice does start to melt in Antarctica and then something is revealed that they're, and I'm not suggesting anything too crazy, but what if something pops up down there that suggests a civilization was there in real ancient times?
I certainly do think that's possible. In fact, let's see. I have, a paper that just came out again this month. Maybe it's 2023. Here's the title of the paper: Widespread Southern Elephant Seal Occupation of the Victoria Land Coast implies a warmer than present Ross Sea in the mid to late Holocene, which puts it, somewhere between 7,000 and 3,000 years ago. The dates they give here. Our results suggest greatly reduced land fast, meaning ice on the land, and likely pack ice, as well as potentially the incursion of relatively warm, modified circumpolar deep water from 7,100 to 500 years before present, with the greatest reduction in ice and warmest water temperatures at approximately 5,200 to 2,300 years ago. And then it goes on to say that our relative sea ice and ocean temperature reconstruction also is consistent with the hypothesized retreat of the West Antarctica ice sheet inland of its present position in the mid-Holocene of up to 1,000 kilometers.
Wait,
600 miles, Jimmy.
Yes.
That means if this paper's right, 600 miles of West Antarctica was not covered in glaciers 5,000 years ago.
And now, would that match up with, let's bring up Graham again, with some of his map evidence that has been brought forward? And I've looked at this.
Yes, and yes again.
Yeah. Well, let's just keep rolling that rock uphill, my friend.
We are.
Randall,
great work, Jimmy.
You're the best,
just
man.
Mention a couple of things coming up quick. April, we're going to be doing let's see, if you go to my website, randallcarlson.com, or go to howtube.com, or to worldviewsmedia.com. That's Robert Dakota. I don't know if you know Robert. He's organizing a conference in Arizona. The focus is going to be the Grail, and the Grail as a symbol of lost technology. So it's going to be a great weekend, and there's going to be some incredible guests there. Scott Walter is, I'm guessing. He'll be there. A number of other people that are going to be making amazing presentations, and you can read all about it. Then in June is going to be the Cosmic Summit in Asheville, North Carolina, being organized by George Howard, who is co-founder of the Comet Research Group and the Cosmic Tusk website. Sold out, I think, but the live streams are still available. And of course, there's always late cancellations, so people could get in on that. We're doing a tour here in the East, the Cumberland Plateau tour, during the end of March, but at this point it's sold out. But if somebody is very interested, I would say check in, because in case there's some late minute cancellations, it's an amazing tour. I won't get into what we're going to be exploring. But so we've got some cool stuff coming up.
And also, and now I'll just make the announcement now. Randall is going to be speaking at our conference, Stairway to the Stars, at the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. And that's November 11th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. And I just did that in advance. We're going to announce all of the speakers later on this week. But of course, you're going to be there, Randall, and you were one of the first people that I called to participate in this. And Scott Walter's going to be there too as well. Yeah, it's going to be awesome. So it's going to be a great year. We've got a lot of things cooking. Randall, you're the absolute very best. Fight, man, some more. All right.
It's a good fight, Jimmy, and I'm glad that we're allies in this fight.
Oh man, we got to do Giant Rock, bro. That right there. We listen. We said we were going to do it this year. We can't mess around with that. We've got to figure out a way to get that done.
Well, you know, my explorations and investigations of the Mojave Desert are far from complete, and I've only really made 1 week and a half excursion there, and there's a lot of follow-up that needs to be done. So, I mean, I'm definitely planning to get back out there. And for also the people who are interested in the geological catastrophe end, we've got several tours coming up. The Great Floodlands in June, mind-boggling. It'll blow your mind to spend a week out and see the scale of some of these phenomena, because that is the only way you can really wrap your head around when we start talking about global catastrophes, and you can see the deluges, and you'll begin to understand what we mean by the diluvial, post-diluvial, and antediluvial worlds. So that's coming up June. Is it going to be the next one?
The Beard of Knowledge, Randall Carlson. Thank you so much, my friend. Enjoy the rest of your night. I'll give you a call tomorrow. Thank you.
Can I ask one quick last question?
You can do whatever you want. It's your show.
If I shave my beard off, does that mean that I lose all my knowledge?
You're going to be dumb.
Oh, God, I guess, okay. We'll leave it for now, then.
Send that.
Jimmy, I loved it, man. Always enjoy getting with you, my friend.
Send me the beard. I'll glue it on, and I'll become smart.
Wow, maybe there's a possibility. You never know. It's worth a try.
I'll talk to you, Randall. Have a great night, man. Thank you for everything, my friend. Randall Carlson, randallcarlson.com. The links are below. And we've got them over on social media and over on our website, too, as well. And that brings us to the end of this fantastic conversation. I want to thank Randall for everything. What I just did nothing but get my learn on tonight. I want everybody to have a great, safe, and fun and amazing weekend. I'm going to let everybody know I'm going to get you jealous. Tomorrow night, I'm going to go see the Eagles. That's what I'm doing tomorrow. Saturday is Alien Con. Yeah, so I got a busy weekend in front of us. Everybody have a great, safe, fun time. I'll see you on Monday. Fade to Black is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Kevin. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy, spaceboymusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR of the Game Changer Network, and this broadcast is owned and copyrighted 2023 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network, Inc. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black of the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. I'll see everybody on Monday. Until then, be safe. Go Beckley Teppy.